For the opportunity to have this conversation, some interest in this book called Recovering from the Anabaptist Vision, which I was lead editor for, along with my friends and colleagues, Paul Martins at Baylor and Myron Penner at Trinity Western University, who's the director of the Humanitas Center for Anabaptist Studies, which funded the conference from which the chapters of the book then presentations from the conference became chapters in the book. Some of the presentations from the conference became chapters in the book. But I want to say a few things about me and about why this question of how we do theology, the question about methodology, is even really a question. And then I would like to just make a few observations about what the book does, some of the themes, some of the questions that get raised, and then hoping that we can have a conversation. So I'm not workshopping. I want to say a few things, and then I'm hoping we can have a conversation. I think this is a really great Sunday to be doing this because the book raises a variety of questions about what it means to be part of Anabaptist Mennonite communities of faith, how we cast a vision for what that means, what does belonging look like, and also presents some significant challenges to some of the ways that has been talked about historically and theologically. So my name is Laura Schmidt-Roberts. For those of you who don't know me, my day job is I'm a theologian at Fresno Pacific University in the Division of Biblical and Religious Studies, the Biblical and Theological Studies program. And I've been there for about 25 years and part of this congregation for about the same amount of time. And I would say for me, some of the questions around belonging and tradition, and also questions around sort of reading and texts and how that's all part of it, those are really old questions for me. So I was an English major at Cal, and that helped, I think, hone some of my skills, but also interest in what it means to try to pay attention to what texts are saying and what it means. I did an MDiv program, which I think really grounded me in asking those questions in a communal context in terms of interpretation of Scripture. And then as I moved into theological studies, which sometimes has the reputation of being really abstracted, some of my own commitments, but also that experience, I think has helped to keep me wanting to hold those pieces together in a really grounded way. So not just ideas about what it means to be church or what it means to live as community, but that those ideas are shaped by the real experiences of real people trying to live out faith together. And that is one of the themes that comes out in this collection of essays, and in part as sort of a critique. So the title of the book, Recovering from the Anabaptist Vision, refers to a piece that comes out in the middle of the 20th century by Harold Bender, who's a Mennonite historian and becomes president of the historians, the big sort of academic historians society. And he writes this speech as part of taking that presidential role, in which he identifies sort of a normative strand of Anabaptist tradition and the three basic tenets of it. So he says, okay, what it means to be part of this particular branch of Christianity is that we understand what it means to be Christian is really about being a disciple. It's about following after Jesus in everyday life. What church means is a voluntary commitment to a community, as opposed to something you're born into or baptized into. It's something you make a deliberate choice about. And that what that looks like in terms of the sort of everyday following after Jesus as part of a community of disciples, is that it's marked by a nonviolent ethic of love. So these are Bender's distinctives that really shape a lot of the conversation and articulation of Anabaptist theology from the middle of the 20th century on, and in many ways remain some of the terms of the conversation in my field to this day. It's a version of those that someone like Palmer Becker is trying to sort of restate in in accessible terms and in terms that are meaningful for us in the current context. But there are also limitations to Bender's model and some of sort of how it gets developed over the successive decades. And part of that is because of some shifts in historiography. So the notion that we somehow have unfettered access to a pristine Anabaptism in the 16th century isn't actually possible. And there's more than one version of Anabaptism in the 16th century, and not everybody is a pacifist, and not everybody gets along, and even within communities, there's more than one story, right? So there's all of this sort of pluriformity and multiplicity that in reality marks the historical origins of this stream of Anabaptism that gets lost in Bender's articulation, where he sort of points to one strand, and that's the normative one. And so then we have something we can appeal to and say, this is what it means to be, a good Anabaptist Mennonite. And it's the danger of a single story in many ways, if you're familiar with this TED Talk. So for me, along with the reading questions, these questions about what it means to be to recognize myself as part of a historical tradition, part of a church tradition, means I have also for a long time been asking, what does that look like? And so for me as an academic, part of the area where I have done and continue to do a lot of work is around this question of how do we talk about the identity of a tradition, a church tradition, a theological tradition, and a particular congregation, right, a community, for example, in ways that account for that multiplicity and pluriformity historically, but also, right, if we just think about who's in this room or who was in the room and on Zoom this morning for the service, we're not all the same. We don't all think the same. We have a common story connected to this community, but even those experiences are not identical, right? So what are the ways in which we can talk about being part of a historical tradition, part of a community that allows for or gives room for the expression of that multiplicity and pluriformity, even while you can also say, yes, this is recognizably a group, right? That there's some sort of consistent identity across time. Does that make sense? So that's a big question for me, a long-term question that has taken has a finer point developed to it even over the last decade or so. Okay, I'm jumping around a little bit. We talked about Bender. What is doing theology? Theological studies, like as formalized theology or as an academic discipline, asks a lot of questions about the methodology you're using. So what are the sources that you use? If we think about theology as giving an articulation of our faith, like what do I believe and why? What are the sources that we use to make that articulation? I draw on my experience, I draw on Scripture, my interaction with Scripture as a way of understanding who God is and what it means to be following this way of Jesus and what that looks like as part of a community, in this longer line of the faithful that we see talked about in Scripture, but also since. So this question of what do you use to express your faith? What are the sources that you draw on? How do we use our minds, our reason? Is another aspect that is often talked about. One of the things that comes up in the book is the role of reason in relationship to certitude, as opposed to sort of this restlessness and even uncertainty. And church tradition, or sort of the history of teachings and understandings in the church, and a history of biblical interpretation, is also, knowingly or not, part of what we're drawing on. So when we talk about theological method, there are people like me who have this as their area of study and are trying to think about very consciously about the kind of sources that get drawn on, whose voice is eligible to be used, right, or engaged. From what perspective am I making this articulation of faith, and for how wide or narrow an audience. But it's also true that everyone who is a person of faith is also doing theology. You have a way of understanding and living out your faith, and you bring it to speech. You do. People ask you a question, not just in a Bible study group, right? Like, how do you think about how you introduce yourself. If you work with young people, if you have children or nieces or nephews or grandkids or whatever, how do you talk about what faith looks like? What does it mean? So there's also what sometimes gets called this ordinary theology, which is just part of being a person of faith, where as we live out this way, we also reflect on it on our own and together. And that informs the way we continue to live it out, right? So there's sort of this reflection and praxis or lived expression that are always informing each other. Sometimes we do that more intentionally or explicitly, and sometimes it's not very examined. It's just sort of how it's rolling. And I think one of the gifts of this particular congregation is really an interest in leaning into elements of self-reflection as we think about how we understand our faith and how we talk about it, but also how that's connected to action that then informs what we're saying. Again, that sort of looping around, back and forth. Okay. Yes. Questions you want to ask about anything that I have said so far? Okay. I wanted to, I'm going to apologize, I think, in advance for a little bit of denseness in like 2 pages that I want to read. But I have some comments that summarize what this volume is doing, and point to some of the major themes in the book, which I think are important parts of what can be good points of conversation for us this morning. Again, the timing of this on a morning when we're talking about membership and belonging, I think, is really great. And so a few general comments about the book, what it's doing, and sort of how it's calling for this needed recovery and kind of reconstruction of Mennonite theology. And then I want to just talk very briefly about 3 of the chapters in the book, just a few sentences each. Mine, I'm totally biased, but I take on some of these questions about narrative identity, right? How do we account for both sameness and the dynamism of who we are as persons and as communities? That on the one hand, there's this identifiable group or person, and on the other hand, I'm not the same as I was, when I was Charlie Rose's age. I'm a different person, and we even say that sometimes, right? Oh, I'm not the person I was, but we also are, and it's that kind of complexity for personal identity, but also for communal identity that I think is important to pay attention to as we think about how we talk about those understandings in an Anabaptist Mennonite lens. And then there's one chapter that raises some questions about a hospitality model and sort of some of the historic forms peace theology has taken for Mennonites, and one that asks this question about restlessness as opposed to certitude in theology, like sort of an open-endedness as opposed to this kind of fixed thing. So, okay. This way? Okay. And did I just accidentally turn it off? No? I just have to be right up here. Okay, here we go. Okay. So this is for the sake of precision that I'm going to rely on notes here. So essays in the book were first part of a robust conversation at a 2017 conference on Anabaptist theological methods and practices put on by the Humanitas Center that I mentioned earlier at Trinity Western University. And the conference was called Anabaptist Theology in Dialogue, Methods and Practices. And it's it's a helpful conference title because of the way it sort of points to some themes across the book, which are as follows. One of the things that really comes out in the essays is this deep dissatisfaction with theologies abstracted from the concrete practices of actual communities of faith, and this critique of a kind of ideological Anabaptism that can emerge as a result, so this abstracted stuff. And instead, this call for a self-critical, self-reflective unsettledness in theology and identity articulation because of the way in which it's always open-ended, always developing. We understand in part, but not in full. In terms of the scope of the volume, some chapters work more to try to theorize and engage some of that, especially the historical tradition in light of these concerns. Other chapters present critical, constructive method and theology proposals, trying to recast some of that. But throughout, the call to resist an abstracted theologizing persists. Abstraction makes it easier to evacuate faith from ethics, easier to avoid the messy reality of actual church and institutional life. And that's a reality that is sometimes hopeful and sometimes disillusioning. And part of why it's disillusioning is because of this gap between sort of abstracted ideals and the reality of how we live it out. So if we would just do a better job of sort of talking faith the way it actually is, that disillusionment might be less pronounced. So grounding theology and identity articulation in the concrete practices of actual communities of faith is important, but it requires attention to issues of power and privilege, authority and exclusion within communities, as well as with their interface with the larger society. So this is one of the places of critique in terms of more longer standing or traditional Mennonite theology, which has often talked about peace theology in relationship to the interface between communities of faith or individual Christians and the larger society. Right, so being conscientious objectors, being war tax resistors, working to address issues of injustice and oppression exterior to the congregation or the community, as all part of the conflict resolution, peacemaking work. But the volume in a number of places, and not only there, but more broadly, we're in a period of time where there's a lot of critique of the limitations of only that as peace theology, where there's been this failure to recognize the way in which power operates, and abuse of power is also part of our experience within communities of faith, including Mennonite communities. And how do we recognize power, privilege, exclusion as part of the experience of people in congregations? And how do we work to think about belonging and what it means to be church differently in light of that recognition? So not only at the interface between church and world, but addressing power issues internal to communities of faith is important, and is one of the things that is called on in a much more pronounced way in the last couple of decades. Again, especially related to peace theology. So it also means that one of the things that I think really stands out as we were doing this work is the need for a multiplicity of voices. There is a diversity of voices in this collection of essays, voices that come from the margins of communities in the United States and Canada. And at the same time as we were doing this work together, we recognized the real limitations of being largely North American scholars and practitioners asking this question. And so the recognition that as we're trying to sort of re-articulate and reimagine what Mennonite theology looks like for our time, including these questions of how do we talk about what does it mean to be part of these communities, that it's inadequate to try to do that without engagement of the global community in terms of the global Anabaptist communion. So we have this collection in this particular volume that has some measures of diversity, but certainly is not engaged in the way we would hope for with the wider global context. And that means that some of the themes that are also really important are things around perceived center and periphery. Like where's the center of the tradition? You know, how do you sort of not just how do you articulate what the center is, but I mean sort of geography. where is it centered? And the center is shift, right? It is no longer the global north. And who is perceived at being at the periphery? And some challenges in a variety of ways by chapters in the volume, calling for a decentering in some ways that are extremely challenging. So questions of inclusion and integration that are trying not so much to just expand the circle as to decenter it. Yeah, and so this is this is one of the places, I can't just read, sorry. My friend Melanie Campen has a chapter in this volume that really challenges hospitality as a model for peace theology. So often my experience in Mennonite communities is an emphasis on the importance of welcoming the stranger and welcoming people in and practicing hospitality. And it's a value. It's a value for us as a congregation. It's a value for me. It certainly was a value in the family I grew up in, and is really important. And the limits of a hospitality model are that if you're just extending the table or setting one more place at the table, the person who built or initially set the table still sets the terms of engagement. And so Dr. Campen's challenge was, you know, how do we develop a different kind of understanding of inclusion that moves beyond, oh, you can join us in who we already are if you fit in. Rather, an idea of building a new table, maybe using some of the same parts, right? Or the idea of building a house instead of just inviting someone to add on a bedroom. This idea of sort of a redesign of the whole house is another concept or suggestion that's come up. But that the question about how a hospitality model on the one hand does engage and include, and on the other hand can do that in a way that leaves the center firmly intact in terms of people, right? In terms of a limited scope of voices or perspectives is one of the challenges. What does it mean to, instead of being a guest, become part of the family? That question is another one of the things that comes through and is really a challenge. So whose experience and voice shapes a community's theology and practices and identity, or those of Anabaptism more broadly? Again, not expanding the circle of conversation, but radically centering it. But yeah, this question of who is welcome and who belongs and who is listened to. In other words, who can cast a vision, right? What does it mean to recast or re-articulate an Anabaptist vision? And so a bunch of the essays in the volume really call for this re-examination and reconsideration and reconstruction of Anabaptist theology from and for the tradition's current communities of faith and contexts, because the context is one in which the topography has shifted. And this part is difficult, but important to say. So, because part of that topographical shift, part of why we're doing this re-examination of Anabaptist theology is that Anabaptist Mennonite theology since the mid-20th century, content and method both, are really significantly shaped by especially one theologian, John Howard Yoder, and his legacy is one that is markedly mixed. So this call for re-examination because of the mixed nature of his legacy, and also the sort of institutional and church failure to end his acts of sexual violence and bring justice, but also to address the needs of victims in ways that were appropriate and healing. So Yoder comes to a very public reckoning in the last number of years, right around 2015, 2016. And what that means is that it really problematizes some of the ways in which theology has been articulated based so strongly on one particular person's view. And a lot of questions are being asked. On the one hand, recognizing generations of committed, practicing Mennonite Christians whose faith has been profoundly and in a flourishing way shaped by some of the theology of this person, and in other ways, as a serial sexual abuser, one also has to ask questions about the nature of the theological project and sort of re-engage critically in what it means to use a person's work, but also to recognize the way in which the influence is so broad in the tradition. So we're, again, as Mennonite theologians, we're sort of in the middle of this period going, okay, you know, the person who has been sort of the biggest mover and shaker for the last half century is deeply flawed. What does this mean for the theological project? And what are ways that gets identified, but also what is the work of deconstruction and reconstruction that more adequately addresses what it means to be human, what it means to be church, in ways that would prevent that kind of disjointedness from a theologizing and a practice, right? So part of the energy around not wanting just abstracted ideas is a hard-won lessons related to trying to deal with the reality of John Howard Yoder's very mixed legacy. It isn't only him, but he's sort of the most public and profound example in some ways. So, and we're in this period of reorientation and reconstruction. And you see a lot of those questions in this volume, also trying to ask what is needed and what is newly possible methodologically and theologically in terms of identity and parameters and the purpose of Anabaptist tradition and all of that. So again, what vision or visions are adequate to such a task? And that idea of real experiences as opposed to abstractions, and the need for multiple voices in conversation is one of the things that really comes through, and trying to figure out how to do that in ways that are genuinely inclusive, as opposed to somehow leaving the stable center still intact. Not because we don't want to know who we are, but because of the privilege associated with the group that's in the center. That's the question. Okay. I want to say a few things about narrative identity, but are there things rolling around in your mind, stuff that has not been clear in terms of what I've said, things that you want to say about all of this? I know it's maybe kind of a lot of academic ease. That's a great question. Roger asks whether if Yoder were not so flawed and did not come to such a public reckoning, I think also would this have not come up? I think it would still, no, I think we would still be dealing with it. It's hard for me to think about what it would look like, but we would still be asking numbers of these questions related to inclusion, related to diversity of voices, related to sort of where the center of the tradition is geographically in terms of privilege, but also in terms of these questions of the real machination of power inside congregations as opposed to only external. So, I mean, there have been, feminist scholars have been asking these questions, both about Yoder and about power dynamics in congregations for decades, just not with much attention gained. Speaking of trying to decenter the center, right? When you're in largely patriarchal structures, it's harder. And so some of this has helped break free or sort of break open in very devastatingly painful ways for people, but in ways that have also been important in terms of creating the space sort of in a more accelerated fashion. I think that would be part of an answer. I don't know, others of you are maybe familiar with some of this and also want to offer a response to Roger's question. I can carry around the mic. It's heavy, this last part. But it's also a period of time where there's tremendous opportunity in terms of getting questions that I think in many ways had sort of been treated as closed, right? We had, clear answers break wide open in ways that probably should have been happening anyway, but in ways that are real and so present opportunities for those of us who are trying to think about this work, and again, for congregations as we also lean into some of this. So, the chapter that I wrote asks this question, how do we adequately account for there being more than one story of Anabaptism, of specific congregations? How do we do that in ways that are, and with the reality of this mixed legacy, certainly of Yoder, but also of historical traditions, right? The church is not perfect. We make mistakes. How do we evaluate what of the things we have received in whatever historical tradition we find ourselves in? How do we evaluate what should be continued and what should not be carried forward for successive generations, right? How do we make that evaluation? And so trying to ask questions about how we do that in ways that are adequate to this pluriformity. I use the work of French philosopher Paul Ricoeur to do that. He had an interpretation theory, and basically what I argue is that we should think of tradition as a text that requires ongoing interpretation. So just like what we do with the Bible, where the assumption is that we should keep reading and rereading as people of faith, but also as communities of faith, and that the need is for this ongoing reinterpretation, in our context for our time. It's that same kind of idea of the reiteration or refiguration of what it means to be part of a particular group. So in this way, the call to, sort of reorient and rearticulate Anabaptist theology is part of what it means to be in a group, a historical group that remains alive as opposed to dead. Because the minute you're not engaging the stuff in the tradition, it's over. It's just words on the page. Whether we're talking about history or talking about sacred texts. So this idea that tradition is a text that requires ongoing interpretation is the model that I deal with. And I think the way Ricoeur does it, it lets us, on the one hand, ask those self-critical questions, and on the other hand, recognizes there is good to draw forward from the tradition. So the big academic terms for that are a hermeneutic of retrieval, a way of interpreting texts, for example, tradition that draws forward the good, that thinks carefully and sifts and draws forward the good, but that also is always self-critical in terms of asking these questions of where have we failed, unintentionally, unknowingly, and all of that combination of things really requires humility. So tradition as this text that requires ongoing interpretation, trying to draw forward the good, but with this posture of humility and sort of a self-reflective criticality that recognizes we've gotten it wrong. How do we make the wrongs as right as possible? And how do we make changes systemically, structurally, in terms of concrete practices to not carry those pieces forward? How do we change it, right? Change the trajectory, change the culture. And the limits of using an interpretation theory like this idea that tradition is a text that requires ongoing interpretation. With a written text like the Bible, right? Like the Gospel of Matthew, you have a text that's fixed. It has closure. And so there's this boundaried set of words within which you're saying, okay, what does this text mean? Right? But you can talk about a beginning and an end. You can nerd out on all kinds of word studies and historical stuff or whatever, but the text itself is still fixed. And that is not true of a living tradition or the identity of a living tradition, right? So, and it's also not true, the analogies, it's also not true for us as individuals. So the challenge of not having this fixed, this closure to the text of tradition is one of the limits. And that's where this idea of narrative identity, I think, is really helpful. So Ricoeur talks about what it means to be a person or a community as this combination of sameness and selfhood. And on the one hand, sameness means we can point to this list of traits. Mennonites like to call them distinctives, and we are primarily very proud of them. We sometimes seem a little stingy about wanting to share them with the rest of the Christian community, or maybe even sometimes a little stingy about recognizing that others actually also embody them. But these things, how do we articulate our identity as Mennonites? Often it's this drop-down list, right? These are the distinctives of the historical tradition. And on the one hand, it's true. Right? I mean, we look back and see, okay, these things have been mostly consistently part of the practice of this group in history. And on the other hand, not universally, not always in the same way, then or now. A list is helpful because it sort of gives a starting point. And for Ricoeur, these he refers to as sedimentation. They're the things that sort of drop out and become identifiable. But it's a little bit like a Polaroid snapshot, where you have this moment, sort of preserved. Okay, you can talk about a group as being this list. If you think about it in terms of your own personal identity, how do you introduce yourself to people? And how different is your introduction depending on which context you're in? Right? So the list of who I am, right? Today I started with my professional credentials, but also a little bit of my story, because I think it was important for you to understand why I'm asking some of the questions I'm asking. When we move Lena to college on Tuesday, that's probably not how I will introduce myself to her roommate's parents, right? I'm Lena's mom. We live in Fresno, blah, blah, blah. So this question of, on the one hand, what's that sort of list of my identifiers? What are the distinctives of the community? And on the other hand, how do I tell the story, the longer story of who I am? That's the bigger context for those distinctives. And then sometimes the distinctives maybe shift or change. It's that combination of things where you are telling a story that's connected to this list of things that sort of dropped out, but that we're always in this ongoing process of retelling the story. And as things happen to us, Ricoeur uses this weaving image as a way of noticing that something happens, an event happens, and it changes the way we make sense of what has gone before, right? Today's 9/11. We started with some recognition of the shift in a whole variety of ways that this day represented in terms of 2001 and shift in the sort of psychology of what it means to be American, right? All kinds of things. From that point, looking backwards, the configuration of how we tell the story about what it means to be living in the United States changes. Think about a whole array of things that have changed in terms of questions around security and communal life and all of that, right? So events happen, actions we take lead to other actions that change the pattern as we look back. And so the way we tell the story changes. And that's true for communities like ours. We have been in a season of trying to do, I think, some of this discerning and try to understand, how do we articulate who we are? What is it? What are we really about here? What is the vision? And we have a mission statement. What does it mean to live into it? And so for me, this idea of narrative identity is something that really helps sort of hold together, on the one hand, I am who I am. I'm still Laura. And on the other hand, I'm so not, who I was when I was 15 or 30 or even 45. That both of those things are true. And it's that combination that I think is a challenge for for us as a community as we talk about our identity and what it means to belong to the community, but also that is a challenge as we think about these larger theological or historical traditions that we're part of. That on the one hand, there's this sameness, and on the other hand, as multiple stories are incorporated into the community, then the community's overall story also is told differently, or it should be. Otherwise, people aren't really belonging. Observations about this idea of narrative identity, things you think it means for us, questions about, yeah.
I know better than this, right? So this idea of narrative theology is just making me think, narrative identity is making me think about Shushaku Endo's book Silence, and the way that in the introduction he talks about, this tree, this Hellenistic tree, this olive tree, and what happens to it when it gets transplanted to, his words, the mud swamps of Japan, and how this tree takes on different characteristics and grows differently. And then the question, is it still the same tree after it has been transplanted? Is it still the same? And if not, is that okay? It just makes me think about this question of what happens to the Anabaptist identity as new voices are brought forward, and whose gets displaced, and at what point, how do you recognize what is Anabaptism? And so it's just making me think of that tree.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. And I mean, Ricoeur would say at least two things. One, the reality is anytime we're talking about history, we're always talking about our construal of history. So Bender, no less than Yoder or the rest of us, reads the 16th century and makes meaning of it in the present sense, right? We can't transport ourselves there. We don't, understand it from the inside, right? So we're always we're always, any articulation of what it means to be Anabaptist Mennonite is always a construal, right? We're always making an interpretation. And those are always multiple, right? So we're always sort of in this sometimes friendly, sometimes less friendly family argument about what it means to be part of this tradition, because it's pluriform. And so for Ricoeur, I think part of the challenge, I think his approach presents in a good way to us as Mennonites who are interested in consensus, is he presents this sort of conflict of interpretations, or this multiplicity of construals, the argument or conversation about what it means to be part of this group as normal, as opposed to a failure to somehow reach consensus, that there would always be this ongoing conversation and some room. And I think one of the losses for some of us who have been in the Mennonite Brethren tradition for longer is the sense in which the denomination or its leadership have shifted such that there isn't very much room for that, for more than one view, for this ongoing conversation to have some difference, that you could still belong even though there are these places where there's conflict or difference of view. The question that you raise about, well, okay, but how different is too different is a fair question. And Ricoeur wants to say, but we're only always ever making construals, and you have to argue for the relative adequacy of what you're saying. So, you point to the history of practices, or you point to an understanding of Jesus in the New Testament and say, this is what it means, and you have to sort of argue for the adequacy of your understanding, which we're used to doing with the Bible, and maybe in some ways less used to doing with what it means to be part of the historical tradition. Because Bender says, here's the norm. It's the Swiss, sorry everyone, or almost everyone. It's the Swiss, and it's these three things. Like, that's it. And that's really not how it was, and it's really not how traditions work. But it means that we're in this messiness always of having this conversation about what it means to belong. But if you're not talking about it, then how do the people who are actually in the community ever become part of shaping the story, right? Then you just have the static box that gets handed down, and then people really don't feel like they belong because it's, you know, just sort of this thing as opposed to dynamic and living. Yeah. Someone else, I see squinting and nods, a little bit of sleepiness, totally understandable. Other things you are thinking about this, or something else entirely different that you want to talk about? I'm going to go Alan and then Lynn.
I've really resonated with what you have said, and I'm eager to read the book. I haven't read it, so I need to do that. But I've been doing a lot of thinking about the relationship of the individual to their place in a community. And it boils down to me to an understanding that things are uncertain. And if we accept the idea that uncertainty is normal, then it's easier to get along with people who have a slightly or even significantly different understanding. And I've come to the conclusion that because there's so much uncertainty, we don't know when we get up in the morning if we're going to live to see the night. We don't know very much about what is actually certain. And maybe I've become a skeptic in my old age, but I've decided that faith, I'd like to define faith for myself at least, is the mindset that I have adopted to help me make decisions in situations of uncertainty, personal decisions. So what occupation should I become? It's not certain when I'm a little baby what I'm going to end up being. In fact, I didn't choose to become a social worker until 26. So I advise my grandkids that they don't need to think that when they go to university and choose a major that that's going to be what they want to stick with for the rest of their lives. And in the community then, we've got all these people with individual ideas about how they deal with uncertainty. And it's so wonderful when they accept each other in that quest. Not only their understanding that the other person is not identical to them, thank goodness, but that the community is an acceptable place for people to be different.
Thank you, Alan. The questions about certitude are taken on especially by my colleague Paul Dirksen at CMU. His chapter talks about restlessness. And part of it theologically is because we do not understand or know everything there is to know about God or anything else. And so whatever we would say is always this penultimate word, right? This is why humility is necessary, but it's also why there is a measure of uncertitude, which is somehow undergirded and made possible by faith, right? There's sort of some irony there. You get the last word, Lynn.
Thank you, Laura. It's so nice to hear somebody so much smarter give us some insights into understanding why we're thinking what we're thinking and how we're developing it. Thank you very much. In his preface, Myron Penner acknowledges that at your opening conference, you were there weren't a lot of third world voices. And I've heard a critique specifically about our congregation being closed to the work of the Holy Spirit, the way in which the third world would have us be open. I am not terribly interested in hearing that critique, but I wonder, as you think about it, how do you respond to that comment?
Thank you for this, for your kind words, Lynn, but also for this observation. I mean, I think part of this is, is sort of where I started in terms of saying it's inadequate for us to think about what it means to be Anabaptist Mennonites without doing that in conversation with the global communion. And I think that's helped by, shout out to Jeremy Bergen, who also has a chapter in this book, where he talks about the things that we might think of as distinctives of a congregation or of a particular theological tradition like Mennonites as gifts that we have to offer others in the larger Christian community. And that means we're more willing to give them away than to try to hold on to them, because they're what make us distinctive. And if everyone does that, then who are we? And Jeremy's answer to that is, well then we're Christians, right? So if he sort of has this idea that if historic peace churches could work themselves out of a job, like that this would somehow be a distinctive only part of the church, that would be great. Then we could sort of all just be Christians. Whatever you may think of that, this notion that our particularized understandings and practices are gifts on offer for the larger global communion, I think is a really important one to pay attention to, even as it makes us uncomfortable, right? And I think especially this is back to decentering, because it makes especially those of us who are used to being in a position of relative power and privilege, and sort of setting the terms of what church looks like or what conversations look like, somehow being able to be gracious and willing to be challenged and receive those gifts, even as we also ask, and what do we also bring? It's hard. Okay, I'm just going to give you thank you, everyone. I'm just going to.
Thanks a lot, Laura. So it's noon and we're ready to break now for lunch and coming back at 1 o'clock, right? No, I wish. So thank you everyone for your participation.